My husband had a heart attack, and I called Elvis. He sent 2 of his guys after me and all my stuff.
They asked me to do it, and I was anxious to do some live appearances. It'd been a long time since I've been on stage in front of them.
It started with a phone call made in grief and ended with a woman becoming the silent keeper of one of America's greatest cultural legends. In the mid-1960s, Delta Mae Biggs was a woman shattered by loss. Her husband, Pat Biggs, had been her world until cancer took him from her. The grief hit her like a tidal wave. Alone, directionless, and drowning in memories, she found herself slipping into a silence too deep for words. But that silence was broken the day she called her nephew, a man the world knew as Elvis Presley, but to her was simply family. What happened next wasn't the kind of grand, showy gesture often associated with the king of rock and roll. Elvis didn't send flowers or deliver eulogies. He sent 2 men and a moving truck. "Come live with us, Delta," he said. It was 1967, and the invitation wasn't charity, it was kinship. Elvis had known that pain, the kind that hollows you out from the inside. He'd lost his beloved mother less than a decade before, and he recognized in Delta's voice the same desolation he had once carried. So she came. She packed what she had and crossed through the gates of Graceland, not as a guest, not as staff, but as family. What no one could have predicted was that Delta wasn't just moving in for comfort. She was stepping into a new role, one she would play quietly, fiercely, and without fanfare for the next 26 years. Graceland was a house full of voices back then, but even as the laughter faded, the visitors dwindled, and eventually Elvis himself was gone. Delta stayed, and what she witnessed behind those gates would remain buried until she couldn't stay silent anymore. When Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977, the world stopped. Fans gathered outside the gates of Graceland in mourning. Inside, chaos swept through the mansion. Staff members packed their things. Friends disappeared overnight. The inner circle collapsed like a house of cards. But while almost everyone rushed to escape the gravity of Elvis's passing, one woman made a different choice. Delta Mae Biggs, known by everyone as Aunt Delta, didn't move out. She dug in. She had lived at Graceland for 10 years by that point, but it wasn't just her address, it had become her purpose. While others were reeling from the loss of an icon, Delta was grieving someone far more personal. She wasn't watching a legend fade, she was mourning a nephew, a companion, the boy she'd once fed at Sunday dinners, now gone forever. But instead of following the others into obscurity, Delta remained in the mansion's quiet halls, and in doing so, became something no one else could be, the living memory of Graceland. As time passed, she was more than just a surviving relative. She became the last original witness to Elvis's private world, the moments no one captured, the conversations no one recorded, the silence no one ever heard on record. In the years following his death, Delta's presence in Graceland took on a ghost-like power. She wasn't there to perform for tourists or participate in preserving a brand. She stayed to guard what really happened in those final years. And while the world built shrines to the king of rock and roll, Aunt Delta quietly watched it all, holding on to truths that no museum plaque would ever dare mention. To the public, Delta Biggs was often dismissed as just another Presley relative living off the fringes of fame. But inside Graceland, her role was anything but peripheral. She was Elvis Presley's father's sister, Vernon's blood, and by extension, one of the few people who could speak to Elvis without pretense or protocol. Their bond went beyond family dinners or casual check-ins. It was forged in the kind of pain and loyalty that only those who've suffered deeply can recognize in each other. Delta didn't move into Graceland to become part of the spectacle. She came to heal, and in doing so, became something Elvis desperately needed: stability. In a house that constantly buzzed with assistants, girlfriends, bodyguards, and hangers-on, she was the only one who wasn't there for the perks. She didn't want tickets to concerts or a cut of the earnings. She wanted peace, and perhaps, unintentionally, she gave that to Elvis when he had almost none left. She made her own sanctuary within the mansion, a private suite with its own routine, its own television, and her own rules. She wasn't intrusive, and she wasn't awestruck. She treated Elvis the way you treat family, with a blend of love and honesty that didn't flinch at celebrity, and Elvis trusted that. In the whirlwind of his fame, when even his closest associates sometimes blurred the line between loyalty and leverage, Delta was a fixed point, It was this unshakable presence that allowed her to see the cracks forming, not just in his career or image, but in Elvis himself. While others saw the legend, she saw the man unraveling behind it. And as the years wore on, her role shifted again, from comforter to silent observer, and eventually to the keeper of things no one else dared speak aloud. By the late 1970s, Delta Biggs wasn't just a relative with a room upstairs. She had become the silent guardian of everything Graceland tried not to reveal. While official statements painted a picture of a beloved icon gone too soon, Delta had lived a different reality. One filled with whispers, breakdowns, and quiet crises that no press release would ever admit. She saw things that didn't align with what the world was told. She overheard late-night conversations that contradicted official timelines. She witnessed behaviors and private confessions that would have rewritten entire biographies if ever made public, but she never spoke. For years, Delta maintained a strict, almost sacred silence, not out of fear, but out of loyalty. She believed protecting Elvis meant guarding the whole truth, even if it meant carrying a burden no one else knew existed. There were moments, sharp, undeniable moments, when the facade cracked. Times when Elvis would retreat into silence for hours, when his eyes betrayed a weariness that went far beyond fatigue. Delta didn't just witness the decline of a superstar, she witnessed the dismantling of a soul. And it left her with a secret so powerful, so intimate, that even after his death she couldn't bring herself to tell the world. She wasn't preserving myth. She was holding back a truth so raw that exposing it felt like betrayal. And yet, as the years passed and Elvis's image was sold, repackaged and polished into legend, Delta grew restless, because what she knew didn't fit into the narrative. And she understood something few others did, that sometimes the truth isn't just inconvenient, it's dangerous. As the 1970s wore on, Graceland began to change. The laughter that once echoed through its rooms grew quieter. The parties were fewer, the visitors more carefully screened. And for Delta Biggs, who had been watching from her suite with quiet vigilance, it was like witnessing a once mighty vessel taking on water. Elvis wasn't just tired, he was unraveling. And nobody saw it more clearly than the woman who lived just down the hall. By 1976, Graceland had stopped feeling like a home. It had become a fortress, one where locked doors, whispering staff, and rotating nurses replaced the warmth it once held. Elvis's health was visibly deteriorating. His weight fluctuated, his energy dipped. The man who once commanded stages now struggled with the smallest tasks. And while others looked away or pretended not to notice, Delta did the opposite. She watched. She noticed how Elvis's once effortless charm began to feel rehearsed, how his private joy, especially with music, began to wane. She caught glimpses of him pacing in the early hours of the morning, hands trembling, eyes vacant. There were no fans to entertain at that hour, no cameras to pose for. These were the hours when the legend disappeared and the man was left alone, exposed and exhausted. Delta didn't interfere. She never pressed, never probed, but she was always there, in the next room, around the corner, listening. And the staff knew it. They began checking with her before speaking to Elvis, quietly acknowledging that her intuition was often more accurate than any doctor's chart. She had become Graceland's emotional compass, quietly predicting storms no one else could feel coming. And as Elvis's circle shrank and his isolation deepened, Delta realized she wasn't just witnessing the end of a career, she was witnessing the disintegration of a man, and it terrified her. Elvis Presley had always been drawn to the spiritual. He read from the Bible, studied esoteric teachings, and filled his bookshelves with writings about life's purpose and the soul's journey. But in his final years, that once comforting spirituality became something darker, something uncertain, something haunted. And no one saw that shift more intimately than Delta Biggs. From her quiet perch within Graceland, Delta began noticing changes that went beyond Elvis's physical decline. His faith, or the one thing that had once anchored him, started to shake. She overheard fragments of late-night phone calls where he questioned the meaning of everything he'd built. There were nights when he'd sit alone in the music room, guitar untouched, staring at nothing. The man who had once brought joy to millions seemed unsure if he'd brought any meaning at all. One night, in a rare moment of vulnerable honesty, he turned to her and asked, "What if I've been fooling myself, Delta?" The question pierced her. This wasn't a man reflecting on a bad show or a failed project. This was someone staring into the void, afraid that a lifetime of fame, money, and adoration might have meant nothing. What if all of this, the music, the movies, what if it doesn't mean what I thought it meant? Delta never forgot those words. She wouldn't speak of them again for years, but they haunted her because she knew that behind every sold-out concert and screaming fan, Elvis had carried a crushing burden, the pressure to always be more than he truly felt he was. And now, as he approached the end, he feared it had all been hollow. For Delta, this was the moment she understood just how deeply Elvis's soul had fractured, not from scandal, not from fame, but from the creeping belief that he might have lived a life that never let him just be human. And in that moment, she made a silent vow. Whatever the world would say about Elvis Presley in the years to come, she would remember the man who doubted everything, but still tried to give people hope. When Graceland officially opened to the public in June 1982, it was hailed as a tribute, a way to preserve the memory of Elvis Presley and offer fans a glimpse inside the home of a legend. But to Delta Biggs, it felt like betrayal. The sacred spaces where she had watched Elvis live, laugh, suffer, and ultimately fade were being converted into attractions. And she wasn't just a passive observer anymore. She was at war. Delta refused to move out. As the Presley estate prepped Graceland's main floors for guided tours and velvet ropes, she barricaded herself in the upstairs wing. Her private suite became an occupied zone, off-limits to tourists, and fiercely guarded. When guides recited sanitized versions of events below her windows, Delta would shout corrections, her voice slicing through the hush of reverent tour groups. "That's not how it was," she'd yell, refusing to let myth erase memory. To visitors, she became a legend in her own right. The Graceland ghost, some whispered. The woman in the window who stared coldly at those passing by. But Delta didn't care what they thought. She wasn't there to entertain them. She was there to defend the truth. The truth about the man she'd known, not the version being sold downstairs. She roamed the halls, appearing suddenly in doorways, interrupting tours with scowls and stares. Some guides adjusted their routes to avoid her. Others whispered when approaching her rooms. But nothing stopped her, because Delta believed that every polished story, every curated display, every omitted detail was another wound to Elvis's memory, another step further from who he truly was. Her defiance wasn't about clinging to the past. It was about refusing to let the world forget that Graceland had once been a real home, not a museum, not a monument, but a place where a man wrestled with greatness, grief, and the crushing expectations of millions. And she, the woman who had watched it all, wasn't going to let that truth be buried under velvet ropes and ticket sales. To the world, Graceland became a shrine, a polished symbol of Elvis Presley's fame, legacy, and larger-than-life persona. But to Delta Biggs, it was something entirely different. It was where her nephew had laughed in private, cried without witnesses, and questioned the very meaning of his existence. And now, as tour guides praised his riches and showed off gold records, Delta stood silently above them, a woman fighting not for a brand, but for a soul. She saw what the commercialization of Graceland had missed entirely, that Elvis wasn't a man consumed by success, he was a man broken by it. The exhibits focused on his achievements, but Delta had lived through the unraveling. She remembered the nights when he couldn't sleep, the early mornings when he'd wander the halls looking lost in his own home, the quiet breakdowns that no biography dared to mention. Every time she heard a story that glossed over those truths, it felt like watching Elvis disappear all over again. The irony wasn't lost on her. The world had turned her home into a stage, and yet the real Elvis, the one she had fiercely loved and protected, was being written out of the script, so she resisted. Not with memoirs or interviews, but with presence. She remained a fixture, a silent challenge to the estate's narrative. Her defiance was not theatrical, it was deeply personal. The world saw her as cantankerous, difficult, perhaps even bitter. But those who understood her knew better. This was a woman guarding something precious, the last untouched piece of who Elvis really was. Delta believed that if she stayed, if she held the line, then maybe, just maybe, someone would remember that behind the rhinestones and record deals, Elvis Presley had been human, that his struggles mattered, that his doubts and heartbreaks were just as real as his music. She wasn't just guarding a memory, she was guarding the truth and the dignity of the man behind the myth. On July 29, 1993, Delta Mae Biggs passed away at the age of 74. With her death, Graceland lost more than a resident. it lost its last living witness, the only person who had seen Elvis Presley at his most unguarded, who had lived through both his triumphs and his decline, and who had refused to the very end to let his truth be rewritten. Her passing didn't make headlines, but within the walls of Graceland, everything changed. Almost immediately, the rules shifted. Rooms that had remained closed for over a decade, her upstairs suite, her private domain, were suddenly opened to the estate. Visitors could now step into spaces that had once been off-limits, walking through the halls where Delta had kept her quiet vigil for 26 years. And what they found there told a story no official tour could script. Her rooms were a paradox. On one hand, they held tender reminders of her closeness with Elvis, handwritten notes, framed family photos, carefully preserved mementos. But on the other, there were stern signs warning staff to stay out, private journals marked with observations she never shared, and a clear boundary between what was public and what she protected. She had loved deeply and defended fiercely. To some, she may have seemed cold or guarded, but the truth is that Delta had spent the better part of her life shielding Elvis from a world that only wanted pieces of him. In doing so, she became his final protector, the one who didn't profit, didn't perform, and didn't publish a tell-all. And when she died, she took something sacred with her, the unfiltered truth of Elvis Presley, as seen by someone who didn't need him to be a legend, just a man, a nephew, someone worth protecting even after the world had moved on. In an age where everyone with a story races to tell it, Delta Biggs chose silence. She never wrote a memoir, never gave an interview, never cashed in on the Presley name. And for decades, that silence confused people. Why, they asked, would the one person who knew Elvis best remain quiet when the world was hungry for revelations? But the answer was simple. Because for Delta, Elvis Presley wasn't a story to sell, he was a soul to protect. Her silence wasn't accidental, it was intentional. It was her final act of loyalty. In a world obsessed with exposing secrets and rewriting legends, she had already decided the truth didn't belong to strangers. It belonged to the man she'd watched crumble under the weight of his own stardom. The man she'd loved, defended, and quietly mourned long after the world had moved on. The real secret Delta kept wasn't scandal or conspiracy. It was the truth of Elvis's humanity, the way he questioned his own legacy, the nights he doubted his purpose, the isolation that haunted him, even in the grandest rooms of Graceland. These weren't the makings of a juicy headline, they were sacred memories, and Delta took them with her. In the end, her life wasn't defined by what she revealed, but by what she refused to let be forgotten. That Elvis Presley wasn't just a king, he was a man who struggled, who feared, who sought meaning in a world that never gave him space to be ordinary. And thanks to Delta Biggs, the woman who stayed when everyone else left, that truth still echoes in the halls of Graceland. The legend lives on, but so does the silence. And in that silence, the real Elvis waits, not to be worshipped, but to be understood.